and our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Margaret Brennan, joins me at the table now. Margaret, the information is fragmentary. In any hostage situation, there are sensitivities involved. What do we know?
This is major, and this is one of the most sensitive parts of the very delicate diplomacy the U.S. has been conducting here. We do know, and CBS has confirmed with multiple diplomatic sources, that a mother and her daughter, two hostages held by Hamas, who are dual citizens, Israeli citizens and U.S. citizens, were freed. This is described to me as a very small victory, but a victory so far in this very intense diplomatic push. The United States has been working with the government of Qatar, a country that is the host to U.S. Central Command, but also is the host to the political offices of Hamas, a country that talks to both sides. And so you have the Emirate talking to Hamas, urging them, and this has ultimately resulted in this small victory today. The hope is, of course, that there are more humanitarian releases to come. You described the 200 that are held. Of that, we know the State Department acknowledges only that there are 11 unaccounted for Americans. They aren't precise on how many of those are hostages, and there is one legal permanent resident of the United States who also remains unaccounted for. So we are waiting to hear from the U.S. government, and I'm told by sources that we won't hear confirmation from them until these individuals are assessed by the Red Cross, that their health is deemed okay, and there will be very careful communication so as not to endanger the lives of others being held.
Two questions. Is there any sense that either of the two released hostages were in any sort of health distress or physical distress? And is there anything we can read into the larger possibilities this early small victory might suggest?
We just don't know about the health status of these two individuals, the mother and the daughter. There is the hope that this is the beginning of something. There has been this sort of complex strategy, if you have noticed, of really focusing in on the dual nationals. These aren't Americans who were on holiday. These were Americans living in Israel who were swept up in this terror attack and taken by Hamas and some of the militant groups associated with that terror group. So that's what we know, and there have been a number of people outside of government working to help them, working both sides of that dual nationality, in other words, talking to the Israeli government and talking to the American government. Here on our soil, it is the FBI who typically handles hostages, but because of the complex nature of this, the State Department and their special presidential envoy for hostages have been very front and center in this effort. You have at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, American officials from the State Department working on this hard, right alongside their Israeli counterparts, in addition to military advisors. So this has really been a big push.
As you well know, Margaret, this is a multifaceted story. You have the potentiality of a ground invasion of Gaza by the Israeli Defense Forces. You also have continued stress suffered by Palestinian civilians in Gaza and increased efforts to provide some humanitarian assistance through the Rafah Gate, which borders Egypt. What about those dimensions, and how do they play in or stand independently of these hostage conversations?
Well, this is a small victory through the Qataris pressuring Hamas, but it is something. It is one of the first gestures I think that we have seen to date from Hamas, showing a willingness to conduct any kind of humanitarian-focused effort to give a nod that they are aware of all the pressure here. But the
acknowledge these are hostages and at least free two.
Yes, and behind the scenes, I'm told, you know, that there were some of those terrorists who went in with the intent to take hostages. There were others who just were really not acting under a command and control structure, so to speak, and just grabbed people. So unwinding this and the complex nature of some of these different groups, fighting groups, has been very difficult for diplomats here. So at a minimum, this is the opening for something. The Qataris at the center of a lot of different diplomacy, including what you talked about, trying to get the opening of Rafah Gate there happening on the Gaza side. But putting it in the bigger picture here, these are two American lives of two ordinary people who got swept up in the midst of this war. And so even this small victory is somehow a victory, and it is something that the Secretary of State and others have been working for. I would imagine once we get confirmation, we'll hear from the White House and the State Department something, but they're going to be so careful.
Right.
because of the others who are directly in harm's way. And the president has really broken with precedent, emphasizing how important this is for him, talking to the families.
Via Zoom last week.
That is extremely unusual. Typically, they try to keep the president at arm's length from these hostage stories so as not to up their value in the eyes of those holding them. In this case, the strategic decision was made to do exactly that, to show how important it is to the President of the United States that these people with blue passports, with U.S. citizenship, were prioritized.
I've just been told from our producer, Judith and Natalie Rahman are the names of the two hostages released, if I have that correct, control room. That is confirmed by the Israeli Defense Forces. Our very great thanks to Margaret Brennan. Our coverage, of course, will continue on CBS News Streaming, your local news, and be sure to watch tonight's CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. We also, I want to let you know, have a primetime special planning to air tonight on Hamas and Israel, The World on Edge. That will be tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington.
You've been listening to a CBS News special report. A diplomat has told CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan that Hamas has released 2 American hostages. CBS News correspondent Christina Ruffini joins us now from the White House. Christina, I understand you have some new details for us. What can you tell us?
Just breaking as we're coming on the air, we've gotten confirmation from the Israelis, officially from the Prime Minister's office. We have the 2 names. It's Judith Tai Rana and Natalie Shoshana Ranan. Were released from the hands of the terrorist organization Hamas. It says they were kidnapped during that terrorist attack on 07/10/23. It also says they were taken to the border of the Gaza Strip. At this moment, they are on their way to a meeting point at a military base in the center of the country. I'm assuming that's the center of the country of Israel, where their family members are waiting for them. The government of Israel, the IDF, and the entire security establishment, the statement says, will continue to operate with the best of their abilities and efforts in order to locate all of the missing and return all of the abductees home. And at this point, that number is still 11 Americans missing in the area or unaccounted for. And it's very unclear where they are, what the status of those Americans are. But look, this is a small bit of good news in what has been a very, very ugly, horrible news cycle. I've talked to some foreign diplomatic sources. Everybody is hopeful that this is one of many. These negotiations are ongoing, and as Margaret mentioned, you know, this is not just a negotiation being done by U.S. officials, but Arab officials throughout the region, including in Doha, where Hamas has a political office. And although that may sound strange, that was set up with the blessing of the United States and other allies, so that there would be a way to contact this group officially through diplomatic channels. And we've seen these negotiations kind of go through Doha before, and it's likely that that's how this happened this time around as well.
And so as we wait for more details on how this process is going to unfold now and how the process unfolded to get just to this point, Christina, I wonder if you can fill in some sort of pieces of the puzzle here. With respect to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, what do we know about his travels to the region leading up to this particular moment?
I mean, I think he was in 7 countries in 4 days. Anybody who's been on one of those planes knows how aggressively you can travel when you don't have to go through TSA. But in this case, they really pushed the envelope because he was basically ping-ponging around the region, trying to talk with Arab allies for a variety of reasons, including organizing aid and other things, and trying to essentially keep the lid on this conflict, keep it from spreading, because this is an issue that cuts deep to the populations of many of these countries, as you've seen protests throughout the region. And that's expected to continue this weekend, I'm told, by several U.S. officials who are concerned, not overly concerned, but are keeping an eye on the security situation around U.S. embassies in the region. Secretary Blinken had a lot on his plate, and the president had a lot on his plate when they went over. Obviously, when the president went over, the original intention was to meet with Mahmoud Abbas and the King of Jordan and have an Arab component to that trip, and that was canceled because as the president was on his way literally out the door, we had that hospital attack in Gaza. Now it's still unclear who exactly was at fault for that, but in that moment, the optics were just untenable for those Arab leaders, and they had to pull out of the last part of that summit. But you can bet that Americans on that trip were working on these negotiations, and you can be assured that that was one of the main things Secretary Blinken was working on while he was visiting all those leaders throughout the region.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about as well, Christina, is what we've been hearing from the Israelis about the potential for a ground invasion. Major talked about this with Margaret a moment ago. It seems to me that we've been hearing about that possibility for quite a number of days now. And with this development, one has to wonder if there was sort of an accelerated pace, obviously, given the delicate negotiations, with the potential of a ground invasion, looming in the near term here. What is the latest that we know on that front? Has there been sort of official or even background conversations about the timing of potential invasion?
We don't really know. There are assumptions, but there's nothing that I would feel comfortable reporting other than there were rumors that this would happen last week at about this time. It did not. There were rumors it would happen earlier in the week, and it did not. Obviously, everyone assumed it would not happen while President Biden was on the ground. President Biden has left, and so everyone has essentially been holding their breaths, waiting for what the Israelis have said would be an unprecedented military action in Gaza to root out Hamas. Now, it's unclear how the release of these hostages plays into that, if it factors into that at all. It could be a goodwill gesture on behalf of Hamas. It could be that they were promised something that we don't know yet. We don't have a lot of visibility into these negotiations, and honestly, we're probably not going to get it, and that's because there are still other hostages to be negotiated for. Officials I've been talking to this afternoon have been very circumspect with what they'll say, even off the record, because they don't want to put someone's life at risk by giving information that could antagonize somebody holding them, or that could blow up negotiations, or that could make it impossible to get more of these people out. Now, obviously, that's going to be increasingly difficult if there is a massive Israeli military operation in the area for all the obvious reasons you can come up with. But at this point, we're not quite sure if the two are linked or if they will impact one another going forward.